So, when did your interest in music first begin?
Birth. I can remember my dad had a band when we lived in this little one-room house down on Kansas Avenue. It was a one-room house. And my baby crib was in the corner. And I can remember standing in that crib when my dad's band would practice. And the bass player, who played a stand-up bass, it just was boom, 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 boom. And I would bounce up and down to the music. So and my family was very musical. My uncle was a famous musician in Kansas, in the state of Kansas. Mm-hmm. And so I was exposed to it all the time. I didn't entertain becoming a musician till I was 14. So that was probably when I first got really interested.
So how did you first become acquainted with the band? Like, who tipped you off? Who came to you about the whole interest in the band Kansas?
Well, I had a band called Saratoga in Topeka. In high school, we were all in different bands, and as people fell away from their interest in bands, ours obviously didn't, and we were the guys that were left. And so there were two bands. My band was called Saratoga, and Phil Ehart, the drummer, he had a band called White Clover. And they were down in New Orleans, and he came up here one time and came to one of our rehearsals. And afterwards, he pulled me aside and says, "Kerry, we got to take the best guys in White Clover and the best guys from your band and combine them into one super group." And that's what we did. There were a lot of guys that got left behind, but the guys that got together formed Kansas, and obviously we made it.
So how did the band first get noticed nationwide, from the record companies? How did you get your name out there?
That was tough because we recorded our first album in 1973. It didn't come out until 74. And we were still living in Topeka, just day to day, barely making a living. And we knew we had made this album for a major record company. So we told everyone, hey, we're going to be famous, but nobody believed us. Everybody thought we were just pulling their leg, So it was tough. It was a long road uphill, basically through touring. Once the album came out, once it was released, we began to tour. And that's how we got our following, was through touring, because we didn't have a whole lot of radio airplay for the first 3 albums. And that's the way you do it, by staying on the road.
So what was the experience like, coming from the Midwest, where there's little to no big music attention?
Yeah.
How was it producing that first album? You were in there with some of the big artists, in the room. How was that? How did it feel?
It felt kind of surreal to be in the studio. We went to the record plant in New York City, and Alice Cooper was there. Oh gosh, there were so many bands that were there. I can't even remember who all they were, but there were a lot of famous musicians were there. And here's these guys from Topeka, Kansas that no one had ever heard of. So it was a strange experience for sure. We knew all these musicians. We all had their albums and stuff. So we were like fans of theirs, but at the same time we were trying to make our own mark in the music world. It was a strange experience.
So how do you feel your writing developed over the first 3 albums? You were writing with Steve, and you were kind of co-producing some songs, but your writing didn't really come out until the 4th album. But how did it overall get better throughout the first 3?
Well, it became more focused. Steve was more of just a straight-on rock and roll writer, and I was more progressive, or the classical side of the music. And I was trying everything I knew. I was just all over the place trying things. I wasn't very focused. So focus was the primary way that my writing improved. There was a lot of pressure on us to write hit singles. You know, that's what the record company wants. That's what they always wanted. And we kind of steadfastly refused to do that. When we finally realized that we're on our fourth album, and each album had been a little better than its predecessor, but we needed some kind of quantum leap to really get on the charts. And I still didn't set out to write a hit single. It just happened. Carry On Wayward Son was the first hit single we had with the band. We had single releases and some success, but not like Wayward Son did. And but I was able to synthesize my style with something commercial. That's where I made the big leap.
So, you obviously said that you didn't really want to write a hit single.
Well, I wasn't avoiding it, but I didn't really set out to.
But how much pressure did you feel from the record label and Don Kirshner?
Oh, tremendous pressure. By the time our fourth album came out, it was like, hey guys, if you don't do it this time, you know, they didn't say we're going to drop you, but that was implied. Mm-hmm. And that would have been just the end of it if we had been dropped by the label. So it was intense pressure because everything we'd worked for all those years prior was now hanging on our shoulders, and specifically on my shoulders, because on the fourth album, for some reason, Steve just dried up as a writer. Maybe the pressure got to him. He just felt like he had been trying to write hit signals and wasn't able to. Mm-hmm. And so it fell on my shoulders, and I just felt like, you know, I've got to come through.
So overall, what was the whole writing process for Carry On My Wayward Son? You know, I watched the documentary. It said you just came in one day with it.
That's it. Well, I have the bad habit of writing the big hit songs after we've already finished the roster of songs that's going to be on an album. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened with Carry On Wayward Son. I came up with this melody, and I knew something was going on with that song because, and Don Kirshner remarked about this later, he said, everything in that song is a hook. From the da-na-na-na, da-na, the guitar riff, the melody, the chorus, even the guitar solos were hooks. Mm-hmm. And by hook, I mean something that really captures your attention and holds your attention. Mm-hmm. And so I knew when I wrote that song, and you know, people always ask me, how do you write a song? I don't know. I've never known how to express that because it just appears, you know, it just comes through your fingers and it's out there. There's no magic formula or anything like that. There's all kinds of formulas that people come up with, but for me, it just came through me. So I came in the last day of rehearsal and said, hey guys, actually after the last day of rehearsal, we learned that song in the studio. We put it together there. So last minute was my signature thing, last minute. You know.
Would you say you procrastinated at all on it?
No, I didn't procrastinate. I mean, I was trying to write songs, but it's just like, I guess I saved the best ideas for last because I don't know why that happened.
I just had to ask that question because I procrastinate all the time, and most of my good ideas come a day before papers due or something like that. So overall, your popularity boost after Leftover Church came out. Were you having more fun? You know, obviously your touring probably got more bigger crowds. You probably were playing bigger venues. Just, was there any real big change for you and the band?
Oh, it was night and day because prior to that we were an opening act for other people's tours. Mm-hmm. We played some on our own, but that was mostly in concert, like large clubs and things like that. not on the big stage. We opened for Queen on their first tour in the United States, the entire tour. But we wanted to be a headline act. And the minute Wayward Son was all over the radio, all of a sudden we were playing in Madison Square Garden and in Philadelphia in their big arena, and in Pittsburgh and all these things. So it changed dramatically for us. And we had to transition from playing just 4 or 5 songs to playing an entire concert.
So after Left Overture came out and it was time for the 5th album, how much pressure was on you guys, you know, to make something better or make something equivalent to Left Overture? Well,
that's the thing. Once you have that big hit that the record company's been wanting, what do they want next? Well, they want you to do that again. Mm-hmm. And I swore I was not going to try to make a Carry On Wayward Son sound alike. Mm-hmm. You know, there's nothing on Point of No Return that sounds like Wayward Son. But it was the same thing with Dust in the Wind. Now Steve finally had a hit. Well, he came up with a song that had some success, but Dust in the Wind, that song, again, it was a last-minute song, and it was not even really a song. It was this acoustic guitar figure that I developed to practice with. And my wife kept walking by my music room saying, "Kerry, you got to do something with that. I'm telling you." I go, nah, this is not for Kansas. This is not a hit song. It's just, I'm just practicing, you know. And I'd play it. Every time I'd play it, she'd stick her head in the door and say, "I'm telling you, do something with that." So one day I came up with the melody and the lyrics. And again, we had already put the album together, but I walked in the last day and played that song for the guys. And this time, when I played that Dust in the Wind for the members of Kansas, they were all just open mouth, sitting there with their jaws hanging open saying, "Kerry, where has this been?" I said, "You mean you like it?" And they said, "Yes, this is going to be a huge hit." And it's not a typical Kansas song at all. It's just acoustic guitar. It doesn't even have the drummer doesn't even play on it, you know.
It's different.
Yeah, it's very different.
You look at Left Overture and Mask, and then you hear that rock and roll, you know, guitars, drums going crazy, and then you just hear this calm acoustic.
Yeah, but it became the signature song for the band Kansas.
Mm-hmm. So out of the two, you know, probably your 2 most popular albums, which one did you feel like was more popular in your sense? You know.
Oh, Left Overture.
Mm.
The 3rd or the 4th album. That was the album that turned the corner. But my writing personally, the way the band played together, we were just all on. That was our apex point. Some people think it was Point of No Return, but Point of No Return was, it sold even more than Left Overture did. Not today, but initially it did. And I'm not putting that album down by any stretch, but Left Overture definitely.
Okay. So, out of all the albums that you helped produce and wrote for, which one did you have the most fun on?
Left Overture.
Okay.
It was by far the most fun.
Just because of all the factors that went in?
All the factors combined that all came together at that time in that place on that album. That was the most fun.
So I kind of want to switch gears now, and I want to ask, how did Protocol come to be? Protocol,
remember I told you about the guys that got left behind when the first Kansas formed?
From White Clover and
well, for 30 years later, I looked all those guys up because a little label wanted to release some unheard of old original Kansas stuff. And so we did, and we had a listening party, and I invited all the guys in the band at that time to come. And that grew from an invitation to, hey, bring your instruments. We're going to make a big jam session out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we just invited a bunch of friends and stuff like that. And these guys, who none of whom had pursued a musical career. I mean, they were doing everything from, one of them was a sports announcer. One of them worked for PBS public broadcast television.
Mm-hmm.
They did it. One of them was an insurance man. They did all kinds of stuff, but they hadn't touched their instruments for like almost 30 years. And so I sprung this idea on them at this party. I said, hey, why don't we get together and record some, just see what happens if we record. So they all came here to the studio, and they came with an attitude like, okay, we got passed over the first time. We've got something to prove. We're going to prove that we can do this. And by gosh, they did. They really, it was different than Kansas, different sounding, but on the first album, Protocol, not the old release thing I did, but the first new album, those were a lot of those were songs that had been played by the band Kansas, as it was called then. Kansas's history gets kind of convoluted because the first Kansas band, the one I told you about, formed between me and Phil. Phil left and took Dave, the bass player, went back to White Clover. I kept the name Kansas. So that was the second Kansas band. Then the third Kansas band happened when they again asked me to leave Kansas, join White Clover, which I did, for about 3 months. And I said, hey, this name ain't going to make it. We got to have it. Because the other guys couldn't play without me. I was the writer. So it's the history of the band gets kind of convoluted.
Yeah. So when Kansas comes back, Topeka, Lawrence, you always go and, perform one song with them. You enjoy that, don't you?
Oh, very much, yeah. It's fun. Plus, it keeps me on my toes because they're out playing every weekend. They never stop touring. They've never stopped touring, ever, in all these years. Whereas I walked away from the touring in about 1983. And so when I have to go play with the band here, I have to practice on whatever song I'm going to play for weeks, maybe months beforehand, just to get my chops back.
So, are you working on any projects today?
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
What are they?
Well, I'm working on a cantata, a very classical, not exactly classical, it's in the same style as a contemporary Broadway production thing. And it's based on the Bible. It's based on John chapter 11, the resurrection of Lazarus. I've been writing and producing this thing for 30 years. It's been going, I started in 1980, 85, I guess.
A while ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. So I'm about to get it finished. It's I have to record all the different I have to record the choirs and all the instruments and the vocals, and I'm going to hopefully release that in 2019.
Oh, okay. Is there anything else that you're proud of that you're doing right now?
Oh yeah, well,
just done?
I've remixed several of my solo projects. I've actually done more than remix them. I re-recorded and remixed them, reproduced them, because they were done in the 1980s, and the things I had to work with then, the instruments, all the fantastic technology now, I couldn't stay away from re-recording them and make them sound the way I would have back then if I had the means.
So in today's modern age of technology, with social media, YouTube, stuff like that, if Kansas were to have started, in the 2010s with all these social media platforms, you could get your name out there easier than you could back in the 70s. do you think it would have been easier to become big, or do you feel like you would have become more corporate, like some of the bands are today? Like, it's hard to explain, but
yeah, I know what you're saying. It's difficult to imagine because I think it may be harder to do now. It's easier to get your name out there, but it's much easier to become forgotten.
mm-hmm.
There's so many bands, and there's so many sound-alike bands. They don't. This started back in the 1980s. Everybody started sounding kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always been the standout, you know, like in the 1980s, Sting came out, or the Police was his band, and they were set apart here. They were doing their own distinct style which sounded like no one else. And there's still bands like that now, but it's really hard to. They're few and far between.
Mm-hmm.
And Kansas couldn't have existed now. I don't think we probably couldn't. We would have been lost in the shuffle.
Mm-hmm.